Hello, everyone. Thanks for joining us. Just waiting for Dr. Babb to join us. Hey, let me just send this request. Here we go. Dr. Babb,
Hello.
how are you?
I'm okay, thank you. How are you?
Not bad, not bad. Thank you for joining us. I know it's been a long day.
It's okay. I'm just going to turn you up quickly.
Yeah.
Enjoy the technology.
Indeed. You're sounding great. Is there any echo? Am I sounding okay?
No, you sound good. Do I sound okay?
Yep. Fantastic. All right then, everyone. So today, everybody by now, I like to get started pretty much straight away. And today we've been joined by Dr. Roberta Babb. Very, very pleased to be as we tackle a subject that's been been creating a lot of interest since I put the poster out on Monday, where we look at transgenerational trauma and the impact on attachment. So before we get into it, last week the video, the part of the video got lost. So I'm going to ask one of my favorite questions, Dr. Babb. Who are you?
Who am I? Well, hello everyone. My name is Dr. Roberta Babb, and I'm a clinical psychologist and a forensic psychodynamic psychotherapist. And I work with mental health, thinking with people about what's going on for them and making sense of their current situation, difficulties, strengths in the context of their past. They're here and they're there and then, if you like.
Yeah. Okay. Great. So to jump pretty much straight into topic. So the topic today of transgenerational trauma and attachment. What does transgenerational trauma look like?
What it's like.
Yeah.
Well, I think it's first important to put it, I suppose, into context, and it really talks about the cumulative impact that of traumatic experiences that have happened to people but have been passed along the generations. So we think about historical in terms of the past and the impact it has in the here and now, but transgenerational, talking about the different impacts it has in the generations and the transmission between the different generations in terms of the traumatic experiences, the memories, the impact.
Okay, so I'm just thinking that when we talk about transgenerational trauma, that might bring on some changes in behaviors and like fears and stigma and that sort of stuff as well. Would you say that's fair to say?
Well, I think the word trauma always has huge connotations. It comes with a lot of loss and pain, and it's a very difficult experience. And I think the idea about the transgenerational element is that it's not always conscious, it's not always deliberate. Sometimes it is protective. And I think when it's almost important to remember that responses to trauma are adaptive, because they help a person survive in the moment. They become maladaptive when someone doesn't have the choice, or they find themselves always resorting to this default position and not really knowing how to be different, if you like. So that when we think about transgenerational trauma, we're thinking about the impact of certain things like oppression, violence, separation, those sorts of things, and how they affect how people grow up, their sense of self, their ability to relate to each other, but also their sense of attachment, which is really the emotional bond between people. And then if you're thinking about that, attachment kind of develops from our earliest experiences. Our relationship with our primary caregiver, like our mother or our father, is the first way of learning about the world through another. And that kind of sets down our relationship template. It also helps us understand who we are, how we make sense of the world. And that can then in turn have an impact on how we grow up, and then in turn how we would relate to our children and develop an attachment bond with them as well.
Yeah, and I think that's what kind of really brought this topic to my attention. And for me, when I was thinking about it, in terms of looking at, say, the impact of, say, Windrush has had on black families in the UK. Now, story time, guys. Sorry. I remember speaking to an elder in our community who was saying, sorry, I'm gonna have to go into Patwa now. Boy, I remember when mommy sent me over here, sent for me, basically sent from them from the Caribbean over here, and you know, she left me over there, and I was living with my grandmother and my auntie and all of that. But then when I came over here, it grieved me. It really bothered me because I didn't even know that mom had extra children, and then she left me out there, and now I'm here, and I'm supposed to call this stranger a woman. This woman, a stranger as my mum, and they struggled to be able to make that attachment, you know. And yeah, it's been of deep effect. And as somebody who was in their 60s, when I was talking to them and they were speaking about this narrative and how much it deeply impacted them. Now, when I look at how that kind of linked in terms of how that they and that generation, who would have been growing up in, say, around the 70s, 70s, 80s, and I think for black people around the 70s, 80s, there was a lot of identity seeking, which kind of steps away from Erickson's typical life stage theory of identity seeking within adolescence. So for many people, they were seeking a knowledge of themselves. So with that in mind, that therefore impacted a lot of the relationships that they've had, the relationships that they've had with life partners, this particular same gentleman has had multiple life partners, multiple children with multiple different women. But when he speaks about the deepest pain that's bothered him, that is the one that seems to be bothering him, and how much that trauma and that attachment has impacted him.
Exactly, because he grew up with this mother figure who was there, and then I think as well, with the idea about parents going to England, for example, if they've been in the Caribbean, it was the idea of providing a better life. Yeah. But I think because it wasn't explicitly talked about what that better life may look like, then when children are having to deal with attachments, it's sort of separation anxiety, separation sadness, grief, but also readjusting to life without this figure called mum, and then having an idealized version of mum in their mind.
Yes.
Then having to leave whatever environment that they've become accustomed to, that they call home, to this new environment where actually, is there a space for them? Where do they fit in? How do they develop this relationship with this new person in terms of mum, partner, siblings? And it's really, really confusing. I think children as well are experiencing so many different emotions: sadness, grief, relief, confusion, anger, anxiety, that then it becomes a sense that actually the world is not safe. I'm not sure how to make sense of it. I'm not sure how to really connect. And so therefore, the figure like the mother figure, who was supposed to be a source of connection, security, stability, protection, they now turn it inwards. And it can also be very difficult then to securely attach to others, because when you're attaching to people, I suppose you have to think about three main dimensions, and you're really thinking about actually the level of closeness, meaning how comfortable people feel getting emotionally close to others. And if you think about an attachment separation, these can be very traumatic. They can be very abrupt. It can be really, really distressing. You're also thinking about the level of comfort someone feels about being dependent upon another, because that comes with security. That comes with consistency, reliability, protection, stability. And then you're also thinking about anxiety, which is really worrying about how or if their partner or their attachment figure, like a mother, will leave them. So these three things can come together in ways that can be really helpful and help us feel really securely attached, that if our partner goes away, that we don't fear them not coming back, that actually we can be close to them and feel actually secure and contained and connected, and we can depend on them. But if we have early disturbances in our attachment system or attachment experiences, it means there's maybe going to be trouble later on, either in terms of getting in touch with your emotions and understanding them, but also really being able to trust, be dependent, feel secure, feel connected, and manage your anxiety. So one of the adaptive strategies we learn is to have distance. And if you think about attachment style, you have different types. You have secure, you might have avoidant, you might have dismissing or preoccupied or disorganized. And actually, these were ways of protecting oneself. But they become maladaptive when there is no choice. They become the default way of being. And so whenever I talk to people about trauma, it's about recognizing that the traumatic response is protective, even though it can feel very difficult. And we have to respect it because it helped the person keep alive and survive. But sometimes we have to find different ways of being.
Indeed. So I'm thinking, because we kind of spoke about this in prior conversations, actually, about how, if you've got couples, say for a couple, for example, who have both gone through that similar sort of experience, what that's like, and how that may play out, and it's very challenging on a family, and there's a lot of, suppose, undoing, and there's a lot of healing, and there's a lot of conscious practice, that sort of, for want of a better word, that needs to kind of take place to actually allow, say, for a relationship or a family to survive in these settings, I can imagine. Yeah.
And I think one of the key things for me in that is about the idea about positive risk taking. It's about how can you allow yourself to be vulnerable. And I think people who have had disrupted or difficult attachment experiences from a young age, they're often looking for the evidence to provide the security before they let themselves bring their guard down, if you like. But actually, it's almost like chicken and egg, that if you have two people waiting for something, then it's never going to happen. And so this is where it's about, how are you vulnerable in a safe way? How do you understand what's happened to you? Because only when you understand it can you start to heal, because you start to communicate. And I think communication is so important, because communication makes the unknown known. When you know it, it then has a form, you can interact with it, you can understand it, you can deconstruct it, and you can also rebuild it. But without that communication, so many things are open to misinterpretation, which end up having a spiral or a negative effect.
Indeed. So, I was going to ask the question, what challenges does transgenerational trauma leave us with today? I know we've kind of touched on that a bit, but if you can further elaborate on that, that would be great.
I think it leaves us with a lot of challenges. And I think one of the biggest challenges, I think, is probably to the family unit, and actually how we then also learn about the world and ourselves and our sense of identity, if you like. Because if we think about part of being the family is information gets shared or transmitted down or passed through the generations. So if you think about a generation that's been traumatized or has experienced brutality or oppression, the messages that they have about the world are going to get passed on to their children. For example, like, the world is not safe, don't trust anybody. And actually what was maladaptive becomes normal, because actually this is the environment. So then children grow up thinking actually the world is dangerous, that, I can't trust anybody. And so that's also one way that can affect us. But then it can also affect us through how we see ourselves. Because I think when people experience traumatic experiences, they often turn the experience inward and sort of blame themselves and think, I could have done something differently, I should have done something differently. And then it can really start to affect people's self-esteem, how they see themselves, their sense of identity, their confidence, their self-worth, their value, all these sorts of things, their beliefs about themselves. So then you can start to see how all these things interrelate in ways that are so subtle but have such an impact, because then that affects how people enter relationships. That affects how people relate to each other, to themselves, to generations, but also to the generation that's coming up. And so then you can see how the cycle can actually be repeated or interrupted, because where there's trauma, there's hope, because actually things can be done differently. But again, it comes from needing to understand and know your history, know what your personal trauma or your family trauma looks like, and be able to face it and begin to heal from it.
Yeah, that's absolutely right. I remember reading a book. It was more of a coaching book rather than a psychological book, and it was talking about healing your family history and stuff. And it was talking about why is it that some families are able to maintain like long marriages and successful relationships, and why is it that some families are able to manage their finances so well and some that are not, and why is it that some families may have experiences of the criminal justice system, and and it seems to continue intergenerationally, and so it's something that really seems to kind of play out today. And the fact that you touched about identity and stuff, so I wanted to kind of touch kind of on in terms of post-traumatic kind of slave disorder, and I think for me it was more around we're thinking around the work around like the Willie Lynch letters and stuff, in terms of the psychology around that, and how in terms of how that sort of lives out and plays out today, the fact that some of the effects of that curse, as it's been noted, is that the demasculization of the men. So men alone are seen as being physically strong but mentally weak. They're kind of being bred to be that way, and females are born to be strong and kind of independent and stuff, and how that sort of dynamic within the people from the diaspora who have experienced that intergenerationally, how that sort of plays out today, in terms of like independent women, men not being able to communicate their emotions, not being felt, and I know I've heard of some people speak about how some black women have spoken about how they feel that black men have let them down and that sort of stuff. But I personally feel it's a lot more deeper than that, and a lot of that does tend to come from like transgenerational trauma. So it's just something that's kind of led me to really look at this subject and think about discussing this today. Do you know what I mean? So
I think one thing that you're really touching on is just that how much pain that comes with the situation, the trauma, the generations. And if you think about post-traumatic slave syndrome, it's really sort of defined as a condition that exists when a population that's experienced multiple generational traumas, if you like, but that a result of centuries of slavery and oppression. However, they continue to experience it in the here and now, in terms of oppression and institutionalized racism in the today. So there's a real sense of the past is still very much part of the present. And you're thinking about, actually, what did people have to do to survive during slave times? And then, you have to think about the context was so different that actually to show certain traits like intelligence, like emotion, like in vulnerability, these were things that were actually quite dangerous. They could either get you hurt and tortured, or they could get you separated and sold and sent away. So you're thinking about, actually, what became very adaptive was about survival. How can we keep a family unit together? How can we ensure that actually our men are not brutalized and taken away? How can we ensure that we can still stay as part of a family unit? And then over the years, the context changes, but the adaptive strategies still stay. And then they become maladaptive because they no longer serve the function that they were originally developed to serve. And that's when you kind of it gets in the way. And I think the hallmark of, like we talked about, trauma is about a loss of control, a loss of safety. Loss is at the core of it, and pain. And I think actually getting in contact with pain, about how we've been hurt, or how you feel let down, or how you feel that some things just aren't going your way, and how unfair the world feels, is so important to recognize, but also understand that it comes from so many generations of people feeling similar emotions, but just to different experiences. But it's very, very complicated and very, very subtle, but it's very, very impactful.
Definitely. And it's not, and it also adds to that, it's sometimes the same strategies that are being used to kind of navigate their way through these experiences as well. So, there's no real progress. Do you know what I mean? And I think it's probably about now that we're starting to really consider how we're doing things a lot more consciously. You know, we're a lot more conscious about our parenting. We're a lot more conscious about how we relate with each other, you know, in a family setting, in you know, within relationships and stuff. So yeah,
And
it's
I think the move to sort of decolonialize sort of different elements of the world that we live in is a huge part of that, because part of it is about redefining what reality looks like, redefining the benchmark, if you like, of standards, redefining how things are judged and understood, and actually going from a position of the self, which is, this is my personal history, this is how I understand myself, is really important, because then people can allow themselves, I think, to feel what they feel. They feel it for a reason. Emotions are not bad. They tell us something about a situation, how it affects us. It's what we do with it can be helpful or unhelpful. But unfortunately, the two things get brought together and emotions are seen as bad. But actually, what people don't realize is that strength is knowing where your strengths are, but also knowing where your vulnerabilities are. And if we go back to attachment, it's being able to be emotionally close to someone, to depend on them, to take a risk and actually be vulnerable and manage your anxiety about them not leaving, and actually sharing your innermost sense of self through communication to be understood. And I think that being understood and having someone emotionally attuned to you is so reparative. It is really powerful.
wow. So yeah, and you know, ultimately what I've picked up from that is how key knowledge of self is in this as well. Do you know what I mean?
But not just self, but history, because you can't really know who you are if you don't know where you're from, but who you're from. And so this is where I think, you know, part of, I think, the transgenerational trauma is that elements of the cultural, the history, the generational bits have been lost. So, you know, do families get together and tell stories about what happened? How do you learn about your family's history? How can you be curious about it? Because if you think about history, especially I think in Black, Caribbean, African cultures, it's told through an oral tradition. It's not necessarily written down. So if you don't have that, you are losing something. And if you think about loss, a lot of loss and how we grieve is culturally determined. So if you're thinking about all these things are kind of like coming in but going away, you're really kind of thinking about who am I? How do I make sense of the world? And it is really difficult. If you can't make sense of the world, then the world is a very dangerous place. You can't feel safe. And so if you can't feel safe, you don't trust people. If you don't trust people, it's very hard to develop relationships. If you don't have relationships, you can't be connected to others. So all these things come together in ways that are really difficult. But I think knowing our family history and being curious about not just the history, but the relationship patterns. So, you know, I often encourage my clients to think about doing a genogram and actually sitting with members of their family at different generational levels and just being curious about who was in the family. What did we know? What were the stories told? What were the relationship patterns? It was really important. And actually that then helps to bring the past alive and present in the future in a way that it can be then understood. And if you understand it, you can then start to, I think, respect what happened differently, but also learn to heal. Because I think part of trauma is also, there's a lot of anger. And if we think about anger, anger comes from a place of pain. But often it's very difficult to actually get in contact with the pain. And I think sometimes learning about your family history allows you to do that in a way that can be quite healing. Because actually there's not necessarily the blame that you may have felt or the anger that you may have felt when you first thought about certain things.
Do you know what's been amazing is some of the conversations that I've been having with some of my friends who have been looking at some of their experiences of being parented. So, you know, leading on from what you were saying, and I've seen a few memes and, you know, posts going out that says, you know, kind of stuff around, you know, I don't blame my parents sort of thing, because they've gone through stuff and they were hurt and they've gone through oppression and they've gone through pain and they've gone through this all at a time when you know, unemployment was rife and police brutality was rife, and you know, there was such an attack on them personally, you know, that life was just difficult. And you know, from speaking to my parents, one of the things that they said was, you know, one of the ways that they used to cope was to go to blues party. you know, and to go to parties and just have a good time. So when people talk about like why is it that poor people like to party so much? Well, actually, you know, giving it some thought, there's something quite deeply spiritual about that. You know, what are your thoughts around that?
Most definitely. But I think just one thing I want to connect with is actually when you talk about actually, I think a big part of healing from trauma is actually the pain and disappointment with realizing that the people that are there to protect you, like your parents, are human.
Yes.
And that's a very painful disappointment. And I think when you can get in contact with it and retain your sense of empathy, that's when understanding really can come, because you can be angry at your parents, for example, and not blame them. But it's about, you know, giving your emotions space, but also recognizing the context, but not to the point where it invalidates your emotions and your emotional response. So it's a delicate balance, but it really is about how you can look at it with a fresh pair of eyes and be empathic and understanding, but also understand what happened and the ramifications of these experiences and the impact, and then think about what can be done differently. How can we heal? How can we understand? How can we repair? How can we let go? And I think that's a big part of actually connecting and hearing the family history and actually hearing how did people survive? Because in difficult times, there's always life, and people find creative ways to heal. And it is about bringing communities together, people together. You know, that's part of, I think, of Black culture, is about a community, which I think over the generations has been slowly eroded for various reasons.
Absolutely. And you know, that collective would have presented itself to them as going to the parties for, you know, back then, and you know, it would have presented as going to church, and you know, wherever there is a gathering where people can be themselves and feel safe. Do you know what I mean?
Exactly.
And yeah, so that makes absolute sense. That makes absolute sense. Wow. So yeah, there was where was I now? How would you say that this sort of impacts our culture? Transgenerational trauma and attachment.
I think it's a hard one, because I think part of surviving a trauma is then also you have to let go of things that may put you in danger in the future. So I think if we think about culture, how things have been eroded, things have had to be let go over the years, the generations, because they were no longer functional, they no longer was helpful. So I think a big part of it is actually bits have been lost, and it is about how you can reclaim them and actually reintegrate them into the here and now in a way that's really empowering and actually restorative. And that's important. But I think it is a very difficult thing, because when you think about transgenerational trauma, the culture that a person is living within is not necessarily the culture of origin.
Yes.
Especially if you think about racism, oppression, colonialization, it becomes the dominant culture, which, you know, often cases being white. So you're thinking about what is being taken on and at the expense of what's being let go. And I think that's where we see an erosion of some things that do with our culture, in terms of actually viewing things negatively or being ashamed of things that make you Black or African or Caribbean or whatever it may be. And I think those are things that we're starting to reconnect with now, and actually engage with pride, without shame, without embarrassment, but actually with pride. And so again, the awareness is part of the antidote, if you like, or the treatment of transgenerational trauma, because actually it reconnects you with something that is about that attachment to a secure base, which is your community, your community of culture. And that's where you feel the connection. That's when you feel the security. That's when you have a sense of identity. That's when you can have closeness, dependency, and your anxiety is least.
That's beautiful. Thank you. Thank you. Right. What examples would you say you have of how we may have internalized our transgenerational trauma?
Well, I think we've touched on a lot of the things already. I think one thing would be definitely about our identity. I think about people's mindsets. I think how people may view the world in terms of it being hostile, it's not safe. You're thinking about what we call shared stress, where you're actually having to have very difficult conversations with children about the reality of the world, which at times is very violent and brutal, which our white counterparts may not have to do. I think there's also a sense that actually there's a lot of anxiety, a worry that a trauma will be repeated, or a worry that something bad will happen, and then people can overcompensate by trying to control too much, or actually feel so overwhelmed that they can't actually engage in anything and struggle with things like problem solving. I think we're also seeing things like mental health, so anxiety, depression, those sorts of things, but also how it affects relationships in terms of people, their sense of self, in terms of who they are, how worthy they feel of certain things, the standards that they believe that should be in a relationship, the values they hold and actually really kind of subscribe to. And then you're also thinking about how people will link and interact with other generations. So you're thinking and actually do, for example, some maybe people that are born in this country, first generation people, actually feel a responsibility for their parents because of what they've been through. So sometimes it's difficult for them to actually acknowledge their own pain because in comparison, it wasn't as bad as their parents. And it's not either or, it's both. But again, it's those things about trying to navigate the world, which is really important. And it's really, really difficult. So I think there's lots of ways that we can internalize it. But it really, I think the core of it really comes down to how we view ourselves and how we view the people around us.
That's good. Thank you. Thank you. So what can we do to kind of help ourselves, you know, because I think we've covered a lot of that in there, but if we could just sum that up, what sort of things can we kind of do to kind of take us on that journey of kind of healing transgenerational trauma, and how we can work on strengthening our attachments?
The first thing I think is actually recognizing that, you know, we've all been traumatized in some shape or form, and it's not about blaming. It's about, I think, acknowledging a very painful reality and letting the emotions associated with that come up in a way that actually validates the experience. So again, they tell you something about it. And I think it's also thinking about how you've been taught, or the sorts of stories or scripts you've been given as a child about how to engage the world and how you are, and actually think about actually how has that impacted me. And I think that is one of the first things that can be done, and to think about actually how do we redefine what strength is, because we're often told that you have to work twice as hard, or strength is, you know, not showing emotion, you've got to man up, or men don't cry. And actually, if we redefine what strength is, which is actually about being able to show vulnerability in order to connect, then actually you are starting to heal in a very relational way, which feels very much true to form. And I think with that then comes, I think, the idea about, you know, how do we look after ourselves as an individual, but also as a people? So you're thinking about your diet, you know, how healthy, how well do you eat? You're thinking about also how food can play a big part in family culture. So actually, is it something that you just eat and you mindlessly put into your mouth and your body? Or is it also a way of connecting with others? You know, the Sunday dinner, the family dinner is something that has been lost for a lot of families. So you're also thinking part of healing is also about connecting with the different generations, because these offer opportunities for stories to be told, but also for people to be curious. And again, that's my favorite word, curiosity. But that's a huge thing about healing, because it's allowing something to come up. And I think then sleep and exercise, you know, all the things that we should be doing is going to be really important. And I also think therapy is really helpful, you know, talking to people. So I think things like, you know, the Instagram Live that you're so thoughtfully putting on is really important. I think educating yourself about the past is important, but also learn about your own history in the context of yourself and you is really important. And I think therapy offers a really unique space where you are prioritized and you can think about you in a situation that is quite unlike anything else you've had in your life. And so that's really important. But if you don't necessarily go to therapy, you might actually find writing really important, because again, it's a way of actually taking what's internal and making it known. And it might be the fact that you share it with others. So again, you connect, or it may be something for yourself. And in that, there is also an important need, I think, for gratitude and affirmation, because I think when things are very difficult and people are in pain, it's very difficult to actually see hope. It's very difficult to connect with the fact that actually the emotional experience is transient. You know, emotions will pass, but when you're in it, it can feel really, really dark. But actually, what are we grateful for? Because if we're grateful, we get connected to our strength. We get connected to the other side of the coin, which can feel very difficult. And like we've been talking about as well, just again, reconnecting with your family, finding out about your family, understanding where you're from, who's in your family, what are the stories, what are the patterns, what were our values, you know, what's been lost, but also what can we take and celebrate and wear in the here and now with pride. And so I think there's some of the things that we can really be doing to heal and actually come through this in a very different way.
Absolutely brilliant. And you know, one of the things I've really enjoyed over the last, say, few years, 5, 6 years, is reconnecting with the elders. Now, I think from when you touch a certain age, right, you need to assume your position as an elder, and sometimes, you know, take on those responsibilities in terms of the younger generations and the older generations. So in my family, I consider myself to be an elder, because there are generations before and after me. So one of the things I really enjoyed over the last how many years was really connecting with the elders that are here now. The stories that I got have been awesome, and the knowledge and the experiences, and they've really kind of helped me kind of contextualize so much of the experience that's been taking place and why things have been the way they have. And it's just been great. So I just really want to kind of appeal to anybody who's on this live and is in that privileged position to be able to reach out to an elder, whether auntie, uncle, grandparent, mother. Spend time and get to know, you know, the family history, you know.
And I think that's important. I think even if you don't have elders in your family, community.
Yes.
Because, you know, we're still talking about understanding life from a different perspective. And I think what I love about hearing stories from older people in the community and the family is that they also come with a lot of joy, a lot of laughter, a lot of fun. And actually it does help to remember and reconnect you with the celebration of Black culture, the celebration, the strengths, the resilience, if you like. And I think it's about having those two elements together in a way that allows people to feel much more connected in the past, because that's part of our attachment system, but then being more able to go forward in the future, because it's not just you going forward. You've got your family, you've got your community behind you, you carry them in here. Yes. And I think there's a process of taking the external and bringing it inside, because no one can take that away from you. You in turn, you know, what you put in, no one can take away from you, but it's about understanding what you put in. Are you internalizing, you know, racist views, ones that see you as inferior or less than or oppressive? But all you see ones that empower, that connect you, that liberate you, that give you freedom. And I think that is a big part of actually healing, is about holding the community, the family inside.
Yeah, absolutely. Because, you know, if I was to kind of summarize a little bit in terms of how I've kind of seen it sort of play out. So, you know, when we think about issues around colorism, you know, I think that's a strong point that comes on the back of this. I think when people are using, you know, some of the self-hate agenda, where people might say, "Oh, stop being Black," as a negative connotation. Do you know what I mean? Is also you know, a result of that. And you know, for me, I find that really quite concerning, really. But at the same time, if you are able to kind of trace back to where that narrative may have come from, what I've actually found with a couple of people that actually do that is that narrative has been passed on from their parents, who were first generation settlers after the Windrush. So you've got to kind of look at that in terms of where that sort of has come from. So I just find it quite interesting, again, you know what I mean, to sort of like unpick and find out where people's thoughts come from. Do you know what I mean?
Exactly. And I think, you know, that's the great thing, that I think there's been this sense that actually to understand, to dive in is dangerous. But actually, when you know what you're facing, you can deal with it. So, you know, the elements that you touched on are to do with, you know, internalized racism, internalized oppression, but also colonial mentality. These are all things that have shaped our ancestors' way of being and still continue to have an impact on us in the here and now in some shape or form. But if we understand it, we can then start to think differently. We can understand our thinking patterns, when they're helpful or unhelpful. And when that happens, you're in a much better place to then either challenge or start to decide what you want to do and let go. Because I think we always have a choice in terms of do more of something, continue to do the same amount, or let go and do something different. And it's always about having choice. And the thing about trauma is that the choice, the control has been taken away. And actually what comes with liberation and healing is actually having choice, having control, and taking the external locus of control and making it internal and knowing that it's within you.
Powers within. I love it. Thank you. Thank you. So, yeah, Dr. Babb, I think in terms of what we sort of covered, I think it's quite, it's been quite informative. And in terms of, getting a grasp of how it kind of impacts us today and how I've sort of seen how it sort of plays out. I think with the lack of trust that may have come, with the lack of safety, with the way we've been sometimes conditioned and to be and not be in touch with our feelings and these sort of things, I think have created a lot of the problems and some of the issues that we have within, say, the Black community. So I think I think there needs to be a bit more understanding from each other, because a lot of us are as I'll put it, walking wounded, and
but not necessarily knowing. And I think that's the difficulty. If you don't know you're wounded or why, it's very difficult to heal. And I think the lovely thing about, relationships and interactions is every interaction is an opportunity to do something different. And so if you look at the world that way, that you have the opportunity to learn, to grow, and either, have a post-traumatic stress response or have post-traumatic growth.
Yes.
And I think that's a huge part of healing from racial trauma and transgenerational trauma, which is about growth. It's no longer about survival. It's about thriving. It's no longer, if you think about, the older members of your generation or the family, how many people refuse to throw away things because it might come in handy? You don't need this milk carton. You don't know when it's going to come in handy. And that comes from a history of deprivation, of having to make do, of having to be resourceful and thrifty. So you can then see that actually what we might see as kind of like hoarding behavior, a bit mad, actually was very, very adaptive. But is no longer necessarily adaptive because the context has changed. But the fear of not being secure, the fear of not being able to provide, the fear of going without is still really alive. So when you have that understanding, you can then have different conversations with people, because it's not about telling them off and getting angry. It's about understanding that actually this person's anxious. Actually, this person is maybe not feeling as safe as you thought, as safe as they thought. And then you have different conversations, and you kind of have courageous conversations, which is really about bringing the emotional element. And I think we don't often actually name our emotional experiences. And I think the difficulty with traumatic experiences is that our emotional literacy is not always developed as well as it could be. So we often think about emotions and it's like angry, sad, but emotions are really complicated. You can have 3 layers of emotions: a primary, a secondary, and a tertiary. And the more specific you understand your emotional experience, the more specifically you can communicate it. Therefore, the more specific the response. So you might be feeling angry, that's your primary emotion. But if you kind of go down to the next level, you may actually be feeling let down or hurt. And if you go down to the next level, you may actually be feeling shame or frustration. So the more specific you are, because shame and frustration warrant 2 different responses.
Yeah.
But it doesn't necessarily warrant a response that is couched in anger. So I think for me, the understanding is a huge thing, because then you've got choices, you've got options. You can be curious in a way that is exciting and empowering, rather than anxiety provoking and scaring and restrictive.
Wow, no, that's really, really helpful. And I just wanted to touch up a bit on, in terms of when you were speaking about some of the hoarding behaviors, because I know that couple of my friends and stuff, we've had to kind of take on that role with our elders, where right then, you know what, we really need to come and do some work on our mum's house. Mum's house needs fixing up a bit now. Perhaps we need to declutter and everything else. And the job and the amount of work and hard work it took to actually get them to go along with the plan to say you're going to declutter or you're going to do these sort of things. Now, not so much my mum, because my mum's bossy like that. Yeah, but for other people, I do know it's certainly a case, and you know, they found themselves clashing. So all the same things that you mentioned, you know, and then they start to feel shame. But it's the safety that's gained from.
Exactly. It's the
Wow.
safety, it's being without. So if you understand that, so I think for me, as part of my work as a therapist, whenever someone asks a question or engages in the behavior, I'm thinking, what is the anxiety behind this? Because
Mm,
anxiety is the first emotion we feel as babies. And it comes to a fear of annihilation. We're either going to live or die. Are we going to get fed or are we not? And so you think everything we kind of do as we get older is about defending and protecting against this sense of anxiety. So if you understand that an older person is actually anxious, you can talk to them differently, still
yeah.
with respect, but actually you can actually think, okay, you need this. What do you need it for? Is there a way that we can maybe get something that's updated, or, you know, or explain things to them rather than getting angry? And it's that bit of understanding, which again, as I was saying earlier, brings in the empathy. Because when when you have empathy, you see people as human.
Yeah.
I think a big part of racial trauma and oppression and racism is that Black people, and you think about anti-Blackness as well, have been dehumanized. They've been
Hmm.
seen less than. They haven't been allowed to have emotional response or be vulnerable. So actually seeing a person as human and seeing that actually decluttering someone is like taking away their armor. You're leaving them naked, vulnerable, and exposed. And although they can't put their finger on it, if you trace back in the generations, you know that actually adaptively, the people who were resourceful, who, you know, kept things for a rainy day, are the people that actually thrived because they were never without. But in
Yes.
this day and age, we can be a bit more, you know, we can be very creative in how we get things. You can click a button, you can order it. We don't need the same sort of behavior, but it's ultimately about feeling safe. And that is something that I think if we can actually be a bit more compassionate and actually communicate around that language, around safety, understanding, and connection, I think we wouldn't have as many fractious or difficult interactions as we have, because it's really coming with understanding. And understanding is half the battle to change.
Absolutely, safety.
Mm.
And
But
you
it
know
feels
what?
like you're seeing something different as well in terms of putting things together and having a
Yeah, you
slightly
have.
different picture.
Yeah, you have. You've done that. You've done that because I think is when you're someone that's gone through trauma, you know, your lens. I call it the trauma lens. Yeah,
Mm-hmm.
you know, everything's through a trauma lens. To be honest, we're speaking for myself anyway, at least. So when you're able to, like, you know, light bulb moment, and being able to connect things, and I do think safety is a massive thing. I've never used that word so much in my life than
Mm-hmm.
I have in, say, the last 4 years. Safety, and
Mm-hmm.
and I'm not talking about physical safety. You know, we're talking about emotional safety. We're talking about spiritual safety. Just safety, just to be silent, and just to be able to be yourself. That's the sort of safety I'm talking about. Do you know what I mean?
And that's really important, because I think when you think about slavery and oppression, you know, you think about being restricted, you're thinking about caged, you're being thinking of prisons. And I think even though people are free, they still have a prison up here. And I
Mm?
think that's part of what, you know, and we take this everywhere we go. So part of what you're doing is starting to dismantle that in a way that doesn't leave people feeling overexposed or vulnerable or, you know, unsafe. And if you think about the attachment, that they're able to be close to people, depend on people, manage their anxiety, then actually this prison up here slowly starts to lose power and disintegrate. And then they are truly just not just physically free, but also mentally free.
Absolutely, absolutely. I think I've just seen a question. I think I want to
Mm-hmm.
ask. How about the fact that we are dehumanized ourselves? That we dehumanized ourselves. An example is today's behavior. We do not keep our communities safe. We perpetuate the drama.
I mean, I think that's a really difficult one, because I think part of what they requires in order to commit to keep a community safe involves taking positive risks. And
Yeah.
actually, today community can feel very dangerous. You don't quite know what you're going to be involved in. So there's something there about actually knowing what safety looks like, but also how much are you willing to kind of do something to effect change. And
Yeah.
I think things are not the same. Communities feel very different. People are fragmented and dispersed. So actually, you know, you think in the Caribbean or in Africa, if someone was in trouble, by the time they got home, their parents already know about it, because Mr. Johnson, who runs the shop, knows about it, who told so-and-so, who so-and-so, you know, and you had that community, you know, that neighborhood watch, if you like, which is missing. So it is really, really, really difficult, and it does perpetuate something. But I think by recognizing it and naming it is part of the issue, because now it can be worked with, because we can think about how do we challenge, how do we think about these things.
Exactly. Exactly. And you know what? I think this again kind of, you know, one of the key messages I'm really taking from this again is again about how important it is to meet up in those spaces, you know, where we can be safe and be ourselves and stuff. So no, that's a really, really important message that I think I've really taken from today, and you know, much appreciated.
And I think the way we can create that is, I suppose, you know, a crisis is a horrible thing to waste. And I think as though coronavirus has been devastatingly tragic and traumatic in itself, it has really forced us to think about new ways to connect. So I think the first thing would be actually think about how can we connect with people virtually, and then think about how can you take that into the community around you, and actually, you know, being a bit more curious, and actually, you know, when we go out about, how do we go about? Do we have our headphones in? Are we on the phone? Are we rushing from one thing to another? You know, what's it take to actually walk mindfully and actually look around and observe and connect and actually see, do you know your neighbours? Do you know the people who are on your sort of like your commute sort of like timetable? And I think that's part of about having curiosity about the world around us and actually feeling safe enough to do that, but also recognising that it can feel very dangerous at times. But again, it comes with positive risk taking.
Thank you for that, Dr. Babb. I want to thank you. I think we're gonna wrap it up around now. I want to thank you for joining us for the last 2 weeks. I've really enjoyed this conversation.
Thank you.
Yeah. No, you brought some real gems for us. Much appreciated. And if you're not already following, how can we keep in touch with you and see?
Twitter, you can find me on Instagram, you can find me on Twitter, you can find me on LinkedIn. I post things about the things I'm doing, I comment on things. So yep, I'm about in the virtual social sphere.
Excellent. So guys, listen, thank you once again. We're leading on to relationship season in September, in this month now. So I'm really quite excited, but just watch out for the next advert on Monday. Guys, thank you for tuning in. Dr. Babb, much appreciated. I feel like I've made a new friend,
Thank you.
Much appreciated. Yeah, do take care of yourself.
It's all about connections, isn't it?
It's beautiful, isn't it? So listen, take care, everyone. All right, and we'll see you next week.
Bye-bye.
Bye-bye. Take care. Bye-bye.
Bye.
Bye.